As the G20 summit opens up in Seoul, South Korea, leaders of the world's largest economies are deeply split over proposals to prevent any country from cutting the value of their currency artificially in order to boost job growth at home. So with currency high on the priority list, we've brought in John Cairns. He's a currency specialist at Rand Merchant Bank, and he's here to look at African currency risk. John, thanks very much for coming through. We're in an era of slowed global growth, quantitative easing, the weakening of sort of the most tradable international currency, the dollar. How does that impact on Africa, do you think?
Well, we've gone through an environment where a lot of currencies are currently facing a lot of appreciation versus a weakening dollar. And what we're seeing, particularly in Africa, is a huge development, a deepening of the markets here, new instruments becoming available, a lot of foreign interest coming into Africa. And as a result, the liquidity growing, corporates moving into Africa. It's a real growth area for the markets at the moment.
All right, let's talk about the state of African currencies, because we've got different ways of managing currencies. Let's start with the fact that there are 3 currency zones in Africa, mainly in Francophone West Africa. Here, many of the currencies are pegged to the euro, and I'm referring specifically to the CFA. How do they manage their currency from risk? Because if they're pegged to the euro, one would assume, and I don't know if it's the right assumption, that they are prone to whatever decisions are taken by the European Central Bank as opposed to their own decisions specific to their circumstance.
Yes, exactly. Well, we just take a step back. There are 3 currency areas in Africa, as you mentioned. So we have the West African franc, covering 8 countries in, as you say, Francophone West Africa. Right. 6 countries in the Central African franc, again, all the ex-French colonies. And then, as we know, within South Africa and the surrounding countries, we've got the common monetary area in which Namibia, Swaziland and Lesotho are pegged at 1-to-1 against South Africa. Outside of those 3 zones, every single country in Africa has its own independent currency, which makes another 25 independent currencies within sub-Saharan Africa. If we zoom in on the CFA countries, meaning the West and Central African franc, as you say, both are pegged against the euro. They've been pegged since their inception. They've only been devalued once, which was back in 1994. Really stable against the euro, not much risk there. And you ask, how do they manage that? It's essentially they keep their monetary policy aligned with the euro. They keep interest rates, as you suggested. They change their interest rates when Europe changes its interest rates. Exactly the same as we see, for instance, Namibia has to follow South Africa's interest rate policy, given South Africa is the dominant economy.
Let's talk about what's happening in Southern Africa and the fact that many of the decisions that are taken around local currencies in SADC are influenced by decisions of the Reserve Bank. Are there other options available for Southern African members of the Customs Union and the Monetary Union to take a different position? Because we're seeing Rand strength at the moment. That should be a concern.
Within the monetary union, no, they do not have any choice. The Namibian dollar in Swaziland and Lesotho as well, they are pegged 1-to-1 with the Rand. The Rand strengthens, they have to move in line with the Rand, or they have to introduce essentially their own monetary policy regime, which is simply not really viable given the size of these economies and their dependence on the larger South African economy. That creates an environment where their interest rates are in turn pegged to those in South Africa. There is room for some slight divergence, such as we've seen in Namibia recently, but the bottom line is Namibian monetary policy and exchange rate policy is set in the South African market.
Still within this context, are there any concerns about the fact that the South African Rand is so strong, it's hurt exports from South Africa, which speaks to the productiveness of the South African economy, but the fact that these are very small, vulnerable, often even donor-sponsored economies, they can't be in a situation where they can just move 1-to-1 with the South African Rand. What can they do specific to their local conditions?
Ultimately it comes down to productivity. You need to maintain the same productivity growth in the 3 linked currencies to that in South Africa. That hasn't been a problem in Lesotho and in Namibia. The IMF has raised some concerns that in Swaziland, low productivity growth is generating problems and may ultimately, the only way they can get back their competitiveness, exactly as we're seeing in the discussions over Greece, is to revalue their currency. I think that's highly unlikely. The monetary policy regime linked to the Rand, South African interest rates, really suit all 4 countries at the moment.
Now, you mentioned that outside of these 3 monetary zones, many of the other countries have their own independent national currencies, but also many of these countries are dollarized economies, or you see a dual usage of the local currency with the US dollar. How vulnerable are they to the current state of the US dollar and the weakening of the dollar and the inflationary pressures on the dollar?
Well, it's not a major concern. Essentially, dollarization arises because of the weakness in the domestic currency, high inflation rates. You just have to think of Zimbabwe, the hyperinflation that they saw locals moving out of using Zim dollars to using the rands and the dollar until eventually no one would accept the Zim dollar and the currency disappeared. And that's very common in some of the smaller countries in West Africa, even within our zone. In Angola is highly dollarized, the DRC is highly dollarized. It's a reflection of the weak monetary policy in those countries and essentially the non-acceptance of the currency by local individuals.
Why have dollar pegs failed?
Dollar pegs, as you note, have failed right across Africa. There's not been a single country in Africa, or in sub-Saharan Africa at least, that has successfully maintained a peg against the US dollar. The key reason, and it always comes back to the same point, is the same when we're talking about Europe, is that monetary policy has not been consistent with the exchange rate peg. So in contrast to the Central and West African francs, the other countries in Africa which have tried to peg against the dollar have not run tight enough monetary policy. It's created inflation. Essentially, their currencies become uncompetitiveness, and eventually they have to devalue or depreciate their currencies.
We also have a situation where, with the surge in commodity prices recently, we've seen some African currencies appreciate because they're directly linked to the export in whatever commodity. So just an example, Zambia's kwacha appreciating 12% because of a rise in copper prices. We've seen the strengthening of the South African rand correlate with a phenomenal surge in the gold price. What sort of outlook do you see for a lot of the commodity producers in Africa?
Yes, you're right, and you pick up on the main example. Zambia, the Zambian kwacha shows the strongest correlation of any African currency to commodity prices, and South African rand and Botswana pula come just behind it. It's not hard to understand. Zambia's economy is based on copper. Of course, their export revenues are going to be driven by copper. It's not so much a problem in those three countries, Zambia, Botswana, and South Africa, because they have free-floating exchange rates. We can come back to Botswana, which is a hybrid system. But it becomes a much bigger problem for the oil producers, thinking of Angola and Nigeria. During the crisis, the oil price, as we know, collapsed from $150 per barrel all the way down to $30 per barrel. This put immense pressure on the balance of payments of Nigeria and Angola. And like it or not, eventually they had to go through a series of sharp devaluations in the currency, created significant liquidity problems in the markets as well.
We've got three leading African economies, South Africa, Nigeria and Kenya. As we've spoken ad nauseum about the South African situation, we haven't seen volatility in the Naira, and that's largely because the Central Bank of Nigeria has come in to defend the Naira on most occasions, dwindling oil reserves as a consequence. We've also seen some stability in the Kenyan shilling, and that's largely because of export recovery after the electoral crisis, but the Central Bank has stepped in. What's your outlook for the three biggest economies?
Well, I mean, if we just go through them, as you suggest, South Africa, the rand, as we all know, is a very volatile currency. Essentially, it is the most volatile currency in the world. Kenya has moderate rates of volatility, at least on the dollar cross, which illustrates that the central bank does intervene on the margin, come into the market, reduce the volatility. The case of Nigeria and the Naira is quite peculiar, though. There we have an oil economy and a central bank that tries to peg the exchange rate, and unsuccessfully so. So what we see is extended periods of no movements in the Naira, in the dollar-Naira rate. When the oil price moves, eventually the central bank has to admit to reality, adjust the price. I don't think, and most economists would probably agree with this, certainly the IMF does, is that system, we think essentially that system is not very suitable. Particularly it creates large liquidity problems in the Naira market. So if you import into Nigeria, you are at risk of not being able to get dollars to pay for your imports. A really unsuccessful system, I think.